Well, thank you for your patience. We were making sure all the images were going to load properly. Welcome to this presentation. This is part of the 13th Annual International Conference on Central and Southwest Asia. Before we begin, I would like to thank the Central and Southwest Asian Studies Center, the Montana World Affairs Council, the Department of History, the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and Literatures, the Russian Studies Program, the President's Office, and the Office of the Provost at the University of Montana, as well as the Rocky Mountain Ballet Theater for sponsoring and organizing this conference. Special thanks go to the members of the Greater Missoula community, as well as to the faculty, students, and staff at the University of Montana who have supported the organizers of this conference with their deep commitment to bringing discussion of important and critical international issues to this campus and community. My name is Gigi Wykes from the Department of Anthropology. I will be the discussant and moderator for this panel. The panel is Women and Islam, Contemporary and Comparative Issues, and we have two presentations today. Each is about between 20 and 30 minutes. We will begin with Professor Fazia Attal from Claremont McKenna College, who will be speaking on critical context, understanding the veil through film and art. And after her presentation, we will immediately go to the second presentation, which is from Professor Ruth Vanita here in the Liberal Studies program at the University of Montana, Rape in India, Myth and Reality. Following the two presentations, we will have time for questions from the audience. Thank you. Dr. Attal?
Hello, everybody, and thank you for the University of Montana and the organizing committee, Dr. Mehrdad Kia and Dr. Michel Valentin, for inviting me here today. It's a great pleasure to be back in Montana, and I'm very happy to be here, so thank you for the invitation. My talk has changed. The title of my talk has changed. While I was working on the draft of this presentation, I realized that I was talking much more about history and social historical events that are linked to the veil than about film and art. So my title is Critical Context: Understanding the Veil in France, and actually it's just about France from a socio-historical perspective. In the past 15 years or so, there has been a surge of articles, news articles, books, edited volumes, but also interviews, debates, and conferences on a variety of topics which could be summed up in two words: Islam and veil. A quick search on Amazon with these two keywords yields more than 600 entries. There is no doubt that September 11th and its aftermath are linked to this flood of publication and interest. And France, in the meantime, has been dealing with the question of the Islamic veil for the past 15 years. And I just want to stop a moment here to explain what we're talking about. The Islamic veil is the headscarf, basically, that covers the hair. And there are numerous other veils, like the hijab, which covers the hair and the neck. There are also the niqab, the niqab, which covers the hair, the body, and part of the face. And then there's also the burqa which also covers the eyes with these kind of grid. So here in France, the whole headscarf affair has, we're dealing with just covering the hair. So that's the veil. I'm gonna be talking about the veil from now on. So the question of the veil in France, which turned into a national anxiety attack, started when a few girls wore veils to school, and with a subsequent media campaign, created a national crisis, which disrupted social and political life in France until the veil was officially banned from public schools in 2004. Debates around the veil popped up everywhere. And very few topics in France's history have been so passionately discussed as the veil in France. Everyone had a strong opinion about the veil. Back in 2005, the University of Montana held an international symposium on the question of the veil under the untiring leadership and with the passion of Dr. Valentin. Interesting debates and robust discussion took place during the event, and the conference proceedings were published a few years later. And you have, I think, few free copies outside of this book, which which is about this conference. So, what is there to add to the question of the veil, which was indeed discussed in all its states? That's the title of the book, All Its States, in this very place more than 10 years ago. Actually, far from dying out with the ban, the veil affair not only picked up steam, but also provided a means to publicly express emotions that were bottled up or latent, and were only translated back then into words and political programs by the then untouchable and racist extreme right-wing party, the National Front of Jean-Marie Le Pen. Emotion ranged from anxiety, fear, anger, as well as feeling of dispossession and powerlessness. It is within this volatile atmosphere that questions such as the compatibility between Islam and France's secular system were raised, along with the place of the population of Muslim faith and Islam in contemporary France. Moreover, topics as diverse as religious fundamentalism, excision, which is female circumcision, the suburbs, delinquency, the very French notion of communitarism, violence, were sometimes mixed up in a hodgepodge in which the population of North and Sub-Saharan African descent became the missing link and ended up in the dark. The way in which the veil affair and the reactions to it were handled greatly impacted French society as a whole, as well as the population that was associated with it, namely that of African and North African descent. In this presentation, I would like to return to the context in which the headscarf affair blew up and how this context helps better understand its occurrence, as well as today's identity imbroglio and contradictions in which France is tangled up. One can never overstress the importance of context when reflecting upon social issues, especially in today's world, where we tend to overemphasize world's connectedness to the extent that tweets and Facebook are credited with starting revolutions. During the conference in 2005, we repeated ad nauseum that the veil in itself is meaningless unless it is understood and discussed within its context. So veiling, unveiling, reveiling is as much a religious statement as it is a personal, psychological, social, cultural, and political one. Moreover, wearing the veil in Egypt, France, Mali, or Indonesia conveys different meanings and brings different consequences due to different histories, obviously. Along with contextualizing, attention needs to be paid to the highly politically and religiously charged terms that are often used by sensationalist media, as well as some politicians and intellectuals. Neglecting context and the significance and power of words are recipes for nurturing ignorance and confusion that leads to intolerance, discrimination, and an atmosphere of civil war. Based on these two simple principles, contextualization and caution with words, I would like to reassess the moment of the veil affair through a discussion of the buzzword French Muslim. And there are other such buzzwords like communitarism, laïcité, which is France's brand name for secularism, but I will not get into these buzzwords. We don't have time for that. So basically, I'm going to try to recontextualize the veil affair and how, how the social and political climate of the time actually brought about, the veil and where, its aftermath and today's situation in France. First, let's look at the facts. The veil affair goes back to 1989, when the original incident took place. And the original incident is basically three school girls in Creil, and it's a city near Paris, came to school veiled, and they were suspended. The local press published an incendiary article about it, and which was picked up by the national press. So anti-racist movements like MRAP and SOS Racisme, they reacted, and then Minister of Education Lionel Jospin overturned the suspension and referred the matter to the French Constitutional Council, le Conseil d'État. As a result, an open letter was written by five French very famous intellectuals, among them Alain Finkielkraut, Régis Debray, and Elisabeth Badinter, very well-known feminist, in defense of the School of the Republic, which they believed was threatened by the veil. In November of that same year, the Constitutional Council endorsed the right of school children to express and manifest beliefs in school, provided that they do so with respect for the institution and others' freedom. To clarify the situation, a circular, it's called the Bayrou Circular, Bayrou was the Minister of Education at the time. This circular urged schools to ban all conspicuous signs of religious affiliation. This ruling relied on teachers and school principals to handle the case, the cases one by one, basically. But schools wanted a standard rule that would apply to all of France. When re-elected in 2003, President Jacques Chirac appointed the Commission Stasi. It's a commission which was made of a group of experts to review the issue for him. The commission produced a report, and so did the National Assembly. The National Assembly had its own parliamentary committee, which was also reflecting on the issue of the veil. Both reports concurred that the principle of laïcité, against secularism, was fundamental to the French tradition and should be protected. In February 2004, the bill was, that banned, and I quote, symbols of clothing that conspicuously manifest a religious affiliation, and of course, in public schools was finally adopted and became law in March 2004. Okay, so it should be the end of the veil affair. However, the interesting part of both reports was buried by the legislature, which conveniently focused its attention on the issue of the veil. Indeed, both reports recognized that the question of the veil was a symptom of much wider problems. In fact, the Stasi Commission itself, while recommending the law, also advocated the adoption of anti-racist and anti-discriminatory measures in the administration, and it also made other proposals for social justice and also recommended the creation of a national school of Islamic studies. Stasi himself, the head expert here, he lamented that the entire framework of proposals was not taken into account. So while the root problems, which were identified by the Commission, such as exclusion and disenfranchisement, were ignored, the focus turned towards Islam. And this is not the first time that France missed a chance to build a vigorous communal society with all of France's constituents, especially that of North African descent. One might remember the 1983 March for Equality and Justice and Against Racism. It was a few years before the veil affair. The march was the climax of a mass movement for civil rights, which came about after a series of events in the suburbs of major French cities, where most of the population of North African descent continues to live today. The 1980s were marked by a general sense of frustration, anger, and dissatisfaction. Social issues concerning housing projects, unemployment, race and racism were ignored. There was an increase in race-based crimes, assaults and murders of youth of North African origin committed by white French citizens and the police. These crimes occurred all across the nation, and some of the victims were children as young as 9 years old. These murders were trivialized by the justice system. The ensuing confrontation between the youths of these communities and the police became permanent. And it was illustrated by the riots that took place in 2005. But one event sparked the march, just one event, just like Martin Luther King's march. A young man from the housing project in Lyon, his name is Toumi Djadja, intervened in order to extricate a young man from a dog's jaws, and the dog's owner, who was just there watching, he shot him in the stomach. From his hospital bed, Toumi Djadja, inspired by Gandhi and Martin Luther King, he called for a march for civil rights. The march left Marseille and crossed France to arrive in Paris, where more than 100,000 people celebrated the event. Back then, French President Mitterrand, who received some of the marchers, again missed the point of the march and spoke of problems of integration and immigration. The movement for equality and justice was hijacked by the government and diverted its raison d'être, which was social justice and equality, towards the narrower fight against racism and anti-Semitism. And this was done through the creation of a well-known organization called SOS Racisme, SOS Racism. Instead of tackling the issues at stake, the government, back then it was with Rocard, created the High Council to Integration, the HCI. And that was in 1989, which means that the same year when the Veil affair broke up. Its responsibility, so this council's responsibility was to reflect and make proposals regarding the integration of foreign residents or of people of foreign origin in France. This commission was to present a yearly report to the government. As might be expected, the recurrent themes of the commission were laïcité, secularism versus Islam, and Islam. The reports also stressed the fundamental principles in France of gender equality, its rejection of discrimination against women, and child protection, as if these issues were uniquely associated with foreigners or people of foreign descent, and as if a council of integration was the place to reflect upon these social issues. As for the right to difference and the notion of multiculturalism, the reports concluded that these were too ambiguous notions to be acceptable. So the Council recommended a stricter form of secularization and a reinforcement of the legislation. Interestingly, women were the focus of several reports. Under a different government a few years later, in 2007, but within the same frame of mind, President Sarkozy created a brand new ministry. This was called the Ministry of National Identity, Integration, and Immigration. And its role was to prepare and implement the government's policy regarding immigration, asylum, integration of immigrant population, and the promotion of national identity. It also fights illegal immigration, ID fraud, illegal foreign workers, visa attributions, and was responsible, among other things, for all the questions related to the integration of immigrant populations in France. Conflating immigration, foreign residents, illegal immigration, and criminal activities is as problematic as their alleged opposition to national identity. Many scholars and leaders of different associations back then voiced disagreement and worries. In June 2007, 200 scholars gathered to express their concern on the danger of opposing immigration to national identity and against the institutionalization of racism and xenophobia. Despite their mobilization, the scholars did not create any impact, and the policies intensified ID control, which were based on racial profiling, arrests, and expulsions. This is especially serious because the ministry had actually fixed specific figures for its objectives. However, it didn't take long for the ministry to become a natural part of the French political landscape. In an article entitled what are the origin of the Ministry of National Identity and Immigration? Jérôme Valliou in 2008 argues against the idea that this ministry is an innovation or the result of circumstances linked to electoral strategies. Rather, Valliou claims that it is the product of a long history and a cultural phenomenon that is more fundamental. I would argue with Valliou in the I would agree, with Valliou in the sense that the process that led to the creation of this ministry also creates an interior enemy and can be traced back to France's colonial history and especially with regard to colonial women. Among the vast scholarship on Orientalism, of which we had a brilliant discussion earlier with Professor Lang's presentation, a good deal of it tackles the ways in which Orientalism provided a rationalization for European colonization. And I would add that we can draw a direct line connecting the central notion to France's contemporary debates around the veil and Islam. Alain Gros-Richard, which was mentioned earlier, in the Sultan's Court survey, and this was in 1979, I think, where it was published, surveys the Western accounts of the Oriental despot and the intense fascination that French philosophers such as Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Voltaire had for the seraglio, which is the female space, in Ottoman palaces. And what they associated with it, that means violence, cruelty, lust, and slavery. Gros-Richard uses psychoanalysis to show how these Enlightenment figures constructed a fantastic other to counterbalance their project of a rationally based society. Gros-Richard's book explores the fantasy, a fantasy which is often associated with and directed towards women. But along with the fascination, there is also fear. Fascination is supposed to take place outside of one's home. It's a different place, preferably abroad, maybe Thailand and other places. But when we see the other in our midst, fear, not fascination, takes over. And the examples discussed earlier with the creation of the High Council of Integration and the Ministry of Identity are the embodiment of a fascination and fear associated with the other who needs to remain other. The campaign to create the enemy within can be explained through the simple idea that the one who is perceived to be other needs to remain other so that I can be myself in opposition to this other. Thus, it is very inconvenient that the other is among us, for it could never be integrated for fear of diluting France's identity or of losing oneself. So now let me show you a few photographs of Algerian women that illustrate different episodes of French colonial, and one of them is of French post-colonial history, where women figure prominently, though they always are objectified. So the first one that you see a part of, you only see a part of it here, but that's okay. I think you can get the idea. The first one is by the well-known painter Eugène Delacroix, and this was in 1834, called Femmes d'Alger dans leur appartement, Women of Algiers in their apartment. And here, as you can see, they are unveiled, no veil. They are sitting down, they're discussing, they are desirable, languorous, and sensual. They are ready for Western consumption. And so Delacroix was granted access to the forbidden world of women. And I want to show you the second one because I thought that it was the second one. So how do I do that? I can just go like that or no? Okay, this. Okay, I just want to to make an opposition with this one, which is by also Delacroix, and it was done 3 years before Femmes d'Alger dans leur appartement. It's called La Liberté, Liberty, and it's liberty guiding the people. So here, this woman symbolizes liberty, freedom. She leads the people forward. She holds a flag on one hand, I don't know if you can see it. You cannot really see it. That's too bad. Okay. Well, in any case, that's the French flag up there. And on one hand, so she holds the French flag. On the other, she holds, a musket. So she symbolizes France, and she is standing. She's in movement. Oh, really? 5 minutes? I'm far from it. Okay. Let me go just quickly through the... okay. So this is basically just an opposition. This is this picture is. These are postcards from the the end of the 19th, early 20th century, and basically they were postcards which were used by tourists or by French settlers, and they were sent to France, to their friends and family to France, and they were supposed to portray the natives basically. And here's for example this couple, which obviously they are posing because they're supposed to be a couple, but the notion of couple doesn't exist, in Algerian society. There's no couple per se. There's the family, it's made of more than the couple. Let me just go through quickly. So here we have, women, veiled women. Okay. Here you can note these naked women, the sensuality or bestiality. In all cases, otherness, and maybe bizarre and different. And the next one, I'm going to go very quickly here. This is a set of photos during the Algerian War. These are taken by Marc Garanger, who was a photographer in the French army, and he took them, in the 1950s. So women had to unveil. This is never done in front of strangers, and you see the different, faces here. They're sad and reflective, or silenced objection, or clearly hostile here. And I'm going to show the last one, which is French Muslims, women raped in French flags in the colors of the nation, probably the most threatening of all of them. These photographs are also the only ones where women are not objectified, since they voice a claim, their French and Muslim identity. And obviously all these photographs have different context and are difficult to compare, but basically they give you an idea, of how women, through the French colonization and then in France today, are viewed or were objectified, except for this last one. Let me see. Yeah, let me just tell you that. One thing is sure, women are more often than not at the center of politics and policies. During the Algerian War, one of the tactics of the French army used in its war against the FLN, the Algerian National Movement, was to divide women from men by luring them into French ways and offering them emancipation. This was done through radio shows in Arabic and Kabyle, and through social services. Rape was also a tool of war, in addition to providing expedient pleasure to the French troops. The idea was, again, to get to Algerian men's moral through defiling their women. Moreover, the link between Algerian women war and sex and French politics is not as outdated as we might think. Indeed, one should remember that many French politicians who led France since the Algerian independence were involved in the Algerian War, such as former Presidents François Mitterrand and Jacques Chirac. President Chirac notoriously revealed that his first sexual experience took place in the Casbah, which is a popular neighborhood in Algiers, where he first contemplated veiled women before going into a bordello. One wonders how much of this experience is consciously or unconsciously at work when, in 2003, answering a question about the schoolgirls wearing the veil, he declared that there was something aggressive about the veil. The case of Jean-Marie Le Pen, which is the former president of the extreme right-wing party, the National Front, is well known. He served as a paratrooper in Algeria during the war and tortured Algerian prisoners. Before that, he served in the war in Indochina. The French political scene is replete with private and political connections to Algeria and is steeped in its history, politics, and its women. Okay. I just want to just come back quickly to what's happening today. This population, and especially, the population which is basically identified as the French Muslims, which are the people from North African descent, and especially the veiled women, this population is at the heart, of the discussion and the politics and debates today. I mentioned the March for Justice and Equality, and I think that I want to show you the last slide here, which is a survey. In 2006, that was a survey that was made, the result of a survey where the question was, how do people identify either as a Muslim or as a citizen? And here you see the results. The specificity of what happened in France with the veil is, I believe, an epiphenomenon that took root and established itself. Within a few years, after 3 girls came to school wearing the veil, women, especially young women, started to wear the veil in the streets, and there were very few women who wore the burqa or the niqab. And these last two ones have nothing to do, obviously, with North African cultural, basis, but it really comes from the Gulf or Afghanistan. These new visible signs of religiosity, we should add, are not indicative of a vast movement within the population of North African and African descent, but they indicate, I argue, a very visible cultural transformation. While there is no reliable data on the number of women wearing the common Islamic veil, the headscarf, there is some evidence that around 300 women in France wear the niqab. Anthropologist Dounia Bouzar, in her study, The Republic or the Burqa, she analyzes this specific phenomenon whereby a minority of very militant fundamentalists preach a radical Islam, which, because of its sensationalism and sectarianism, invaded the social media and the public space. And all sorts of practices are invoked in the name of Islam. And she shows in her studies how the Salafist, which is a strict and puritanical approach to Islam, this branch of Islam, which she argues is a cult, is conflated in France's imagination and in the media with Islam, and as it is practiced by French Muslims. And do I have 1 minute to mention something here, which is important? I want to just pause a minute for to talk a little bit about the expression French Muslim. I have not used this expression until now, and this for several reasons. First, this is the first time such an expression is used for any group of people living in France. Obviously, the expressions French Jew, French Protestant, or French Buddhist, for that matter, do not exist in the French common language. The mere fact that there was a need to add Muslim to the adjective French signifies, in the French context, that this population is not totally French and cannot be. This was the case a few generations back when, after being called Arabs, Maghrebis, or simply North Africans, the second generation was called Beur, which is the reverse of the word Arab. Now this segment of the population is called French Muslim to encompass all the former Beurs, as well as the former and new immigrants from North Africa, in a broad and sweeping new expression. Moreover, the adjective Muslim is confusing and blurs many distinctions because it supposes that all the descendants of North Africans and Africans are Muslims and therefore practice Islam and consider themselves Muslims, which is not the case. The figure of 5 million Muslims in France, which is used by academics, politicians, and the media, is once again misleading because French law prohibits religious census. It's just forbidden. It is actually impossible to determine how many Muslims there are in France. So the figure of 5 million represents the total population originating from North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, with a small number of people of other countries with a Muslim population, which for the majority do not practice Islam and whose relationship to Islam is essentially cultural. On a different note, though the majority of the targeted population does not practice Islam and has a cultural relationship to it, they do feel targeted by the media hype and discourses about Islam. So just because one doesn't practice Islam or has a kind of cultural relationship to it doesn't mean that they don't feel, targeted when the media speaks about Muslims. My second point is the expression French Muslims, which might seem natural for an English speaker, brings the population it refers to back to the colonial era yet again. Indeed, the syntagm, the phrase French Muslim is the term used to refer to the natives in Algeria to distinguish them from the French, because the French call themselves Algerians because they lived in Algeria, so they called the natives French Muslims. This new expression, which designates Islam and, more importantly, the population associated with it as incompatible with the French Republic, is, I argue, a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I'm almost done here. Indeed, as it is often the case, the term has been appropriated by not only radical Muslims, which are a minority, but also by practicing Muslims, as well as others less drawn to religion. To constantly refer someone back to a religion in order to underline their inadequacy could be construed as a challenge that one finally accepts. And finally, it seems to me that this expression also plays into the widespread demographic nightmare of being overrun by Muslims of the coming Eurabia. The 2003 creation by Sarkozy of the French Council of the Muslim Faith seems to demonstrate this, for the council was formed to control the Muslim population through the creation of a government structure and to designate an interlocutor with this population as if it could not be reached otherwise. So much so that during the riots that took place in 2005 again, and spread all over France, the French police called on this council of Muslim faith, for help, while the riots had nothing to do with religion. I argue that the veil is the symbol of this fear and nightmare, and every few years, the veil is at the center of polemics and debates. In 2011, a law was passed that forbid the concealment of the face in public spaces. And despite its formulation, it refers to the niqab or the burqa, which concerns approximately 2,000 women in France. Only a few months ago, in 2014, I think it was in October, there was a discussion of a law to ban the veil in French universities. While the media and the public sphere is dominated by right-wing figures such as journalist Éric Zemmour, who is one of the most read and listened to media magnate in France, and the author of a book called The French Suicide, which came out in 2014, where he discusses how within 40 years, France has lost its fundamental values, and notably through immigration and Islam. Or reactionary philosophers such as Alain Finkielkraut, there is little space to reflect or for real dialogue. It is as if, once again, there is a deep desire to alienate this segment of the French population while keeping the fascination and the fantasy going. No one went as far as the articulation, no one went as far in the articulation of this desire and fantasy as France's well-known famous writer Michel Houellebecq, who wrote a successful novel called Submission, Soumission, which is intended to refer to the translation of the word Islam, which means submission. This novel is set in the near future, where France is led by a Muslim president who turns France into a Muslim country. This is obviously a nightmare for most French people. To add to the irony of it all, the novel came out only a few days before the attacks on Charlie Hebdo. And I will end up with the following question. When will France traverse the fantasy and move on to become a truly open, democratic society? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very provocative paper. And now Dr. Vanita will speak on India, rape, the myth and reality.
Okay, so from the media these days, one gets the impression that India, as one article put it, is the rape capital of the world. In the documentary film India's Daughter by a British woman filmmaker, which unfortunately that film has been banned in India, the filmmaker interviews a rapist murderer who is in prison he's awaiting execution for gang raping and murdering a young woman in Delhi in December 2012. This was the rape and murder that set in motion the view that India is the most dangerous place for women. That now she interviews the rapist murderer in prison, and he says that women who are out at night should expect to be raped, and she shouldn't have fought back, and then they wouldn't have killed her. Then the filmmaker remarks that many people share his views. In the comment section on a totally unrelated article, I read a comment saying, in India, it's normal for women who are out after 9 p.m. to be raped. So let's check this view against the facts and figures and facts. I'm going to start with the figures. Let's begin with some statistics that the Delhi Police Force released. In 2014, Delhi is the capital city of India, where Jyoti was gang raped and murdered. It has a population of about 25 million. 1,704 rapes and 3,485 cases of sexual molestation were reported in Delhi up to October 15, 2014. Now, of course, rape is one of the most underreported crimes everywhere in the world. But if we look at the statistics from other countries where it's likely to be underreported, like Bahrain, for example, we still find this a relatively low rate. I can do it. Of course, yeah, it also works from here. And more importantly, India also has a relatively high conviction rate, and that is a fact. There's no question of underreporting here. India has a relatively high conviction rate, as you can see from this table. An article in Time magazine, the Indian edition, pointed out that the reason that rapes in India got so much more attention than, say, the epidemic of rape in South Africa or any single rape case in the US is because of two reasons. One, the scale of the protests. After Jyoti was raped and killed in December 2012, there were continuous protests outside Parliament, which is the seat of government in Delhi, by thousands of people who camped out day and night for about a month. I don't know of any similar protests on that scale in any other country. Second, the Indian media covered it day after day as headlines. Both the TV and the print media covered it as headlines for weeks and weeks. And this, therefore, because it got this kind of media attention, it was picked up by the international media. These two factors, the scale of the protests and the scale of the media attention, is what made it seem that the rapes themselves are so much more and so much more frequent than in other places. Anyway, there's an article from a South African newspaper, the picture will probably come up later, I couldn't find it, that in the same year as Jyoti was raped and killed, and I will give the details of this rape a little later, a 17-year-old girl in South Africa in 2012 was gang raped and killed in a very similar way. But there were protests, but they were smaller and more muted, so the international media never picked up the case, and I had never heard of it till I read this article. So the scale of the protests in India is not, I would say, because the situation is worse, because there are more rapes, but because of the power of Indian women's and civil rights groups and movements, which have a long history dating back to the movement for social reform in the 19th century, followed by the Gandhi-led independence movement, in which women were involved on a very large scale. And women were also involved in the communist-led movements and in the movements on the Hindu right as well. So I want to go back to talk about the history of, a brief look at the history of anti-rape protests in India. The first major nationwide protest against rape took place in 1980. This is a picture outside Parliament. I was there at this protest. The Supreme Court of India had ruled in 1979 that in the case of a young agricultural worker called Mathura, who went to a police station in a rural area and was raped by two policemen there. And this case took a long time to go up through the courts, and it got to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said there were no marks of violence on her body, and so she probably consented, and there's no proof that it's rape, basically. So then, four eminent lawyers, 2 men and 2 women, wrote an open letter of protest to the Supreme Court. The media publicized this letter, and that's how that rape in the village came to media attention and to people's attention. Then women's groups organized nationwide and held protests, especially on International Women's Day, which was March 8, 1980. In 1978 to 79, I was one of the 2 founders of Manushi, India's first nationwide feminist magazine, and I couldn't find that particular cover of the magazine, but basically rape was a big issue at that time. And as a result of these protests in 1980, the rape law was actually changed by Parliament in 1983. And these were the changes. A woman's statement of non-consent was made a rebuttable presumption. That is, more or less, the burden of proof was shifted. The category of custodial rape was created, which means that if a woman is in a place where she is in the custody of powerful authority figures, employers or policemen or wardens in a prison, then there's a more severe punishment for them. them. And okay, so now, so that the law had already been changed. But now we fast forward to 16 December 2012. Jyoti Singh Pandey was a 23-year-old, you may already know these details, but I'm going to quickly go over them. A 23-year-old physiotherapy student who was returning home around 9 p.m. in Delhi from seeing a movie with her boyfriend, Avindra Pandey. And they boarded a private bus, not realizing that the bus was not in service. 6 men who were employees of the private bus company taunted them and said, why are you out so late at night, and are you married, and so on and so forth. And when Jyoti sort of protested and resisted, they dragged her to the back of the bus where they beat her severely. They also beat up her boyfriend and put him in a wheelchair. And there were 6 men, and the youngest of them, who was a 17-year-old, used iron rods to penetrate her, dragging out her intestines. And they stripped both of them, both him and her, and threw them out on the road at a busy intersection, and then tried to run over her with the bus. And Avindra managed to pull her to safety, but her injuries were extensive. She was wounded all over the body, and she was then, she was taken to Singapore for further treatment, but she managed to give a statement. She was conscious, she gave a statement, and she died on 29 December in Singapore. Now, these are, I can't, the pictures don't reproduce the scale of the protest, but the case was covered by the media almost 24/7, and huge protests started on 21st December. People camped out round the clock near Parliament, and there were tens of thousands of protesters in Delhi, but also very large protests in numerous other cities and towns, which continued through January 2013. There were also numerous smaller protests, like this one, by employees of various organizations and in educational institutions and so on. So under this pressure, the police arrested all the accused within 24 hours. And that's very unusual for the police to be so efficient. The case was fast-tracked. The 4 men were sentenced to death for murder. The juvenile was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment, which was the maximum he could get because he was underage. He was 17 years old. And the 6th man hanged himself in jail. The government reacted immediately. There was discussion in Parliament. The head of the ruling party went and received her body at the airport. The chief minister of Delhi was there. But protests spread across South Asia, and Indians in other countries also protested as well, for example, in London and many other places. In response to this, many states instituted measures like 24/7 helplines for women who were being attacked, committees to track cases of violence, to set up fast-track courts, and so on. The biggest change was changing the rape law. Now, there's a woman lawyer called Kirti Singh, whom I happen to know, and she had drafted this. She had created a changed rape law, and that rape law draft was just languishing. Nothing had happened with it. But when this case took place, that rape law was passed. And these are the new provisions of that law. The law states that once a sexual act is proved to have taken place, the woman states that she did not consent, unsupported by any other evidence. This is sufficient to convict the man of rape and send him to prison for a minimum of 7 years. Now, it also introduces new ideas that any unwelcome and explicit sexual overtures, or demand or request for sexual favors, or making sexually colored remarks, or forcibly showing pornography, or any other unwelcome physical, verbal, non-verbal conduct of sexual nature can lead to your going to prison, varying terms, 1 year to 2 years. Now, these provisions are all borrowed from, I think, from sexual conduct codes on campuses in Western countries, which I think, fortunately, have not yet become law in Western countries. Now, 2 provisions that the woman lawyer had in the law were rejected by Parliament. She had introduced marital rape as a crime, and they removed that. She had made rape a gender-neutral offense. They removed that. So now, in the rape law, only a man can rape a woman. Male-male rape, for instance, is not recognized. In the following years, now this is a new provision was introduced in the Criminal Amendment Act. I showed you a picture. In the protests, there were many, many protests for this rape, but also for several other rapes. In 2013, this is the South African gang rape and murder case I was referring to. In 2012, this woman called Suzette Jordan, a single mother, was raped outside a nightclub in Kolkata, and these are the protests in Kolkata. Another one. In Mumbai, a young woman photojournalist, was ambushed. She went into a deserted factory to photograph it, and she was ambushed by 7 men who used to lie in wait there and rape women and gang raped. Under the new rape law, 4 men were sentenced to death for this repeat rape. Repeat rape in the sense that they raped her and then raped her again after 5 minutes. So that was the repeat rape, under which they were sentenced to death for repeat rape, 2 of them to life imprisonment, and 1 juvenile to the maximum of 3 years imprisonment. The Supreme Court has stayed the execution, so this is still awaited. India has a relatively low rate of actually implementing the death penalty. It's supposed to be reserved for the rare cases. I would say that the protests are great, of course, but they have a dark side, and this is the demand for the death penalty. There were many protesters who said, hang them, lynch them, tear out their intestines, do the same thing to them in public that they did, hand them over to us, we'll kill them, and things like that. So now we have an interesting situation where India, which is the world's largest secular democracy, is now in the company of dictatorships in executing people for rape. For instance, if you cut off somebody's arm or you blind them, and these have happened in rural India, this is known as grievous assault in the law. And the penalty is the same as for rape. You get 7 years imprisonment. But if you repeat the offense, that is, you rape someone twice, you can be executed under this new law. But if you repeat the offense of blinding someone, or you've cut off one arm, then you cut off the next arm, you can get a maximum of 7 years in prison again. Now, I would ask why the difference is. Now, what it suggests is why, if you rape someone twice, you can be executed, whereas if you cut off somebody's arm and then cut off another arm, you get only 7 years plus 7 years. Now, what I think lies behind this is the suggestion, the idea that rape is as bad as death or worse than death. Otherwise, execution in India is only for murder. So what I would ask is it worse to be raped than to lose your eyes or your arms or your legs? Or what is involved here a hangover about the loss of honor in rape, involved in rape? And I looked at the headlines in national and international media on the Jyoti Pandey case. And all the headlines, when they referred to the men as rapists, as if, and you know, what those men did and what they were sentenced to death for was torturing and murdering her. They tortured her to death. That is more important than the fact that they were rapists. But they were referred to constantly as rapists and not as murderers. So likewise, I would also argue that the new law undermines the basis of law in a democracy. The basis of law in democracy is that a person is innocent until proven guilty. And I could give more examples, but I won't. I'll go on to the next point, which is that the recent anti-rape protests and the way the media has reported it has created the impression that India is a horrible place for women to live. Now, India is a country of 1.2 billion people. That's the size of Western Europe. So yes, of course, many women are oppressed and exploited, abused, raped, etc. But many are also widely respected. India has had a woman prime minister. India has had a woman president and several very powerful chief ministers. This is one chief minister. This is another one from this formerly so-called untouchable community, and there's several chief ministers who are single women. Currently, women hold very important cabinet positions. This is in a ruling Hindu right-wing party. The woman holds important cabinet positions, but that is true of all parties. And more important, India produces millions of women doctors, businesswomen, corporate executives, engineers, scientists, professors in all disciplines. I skipped, yeah. So millions of women are routinely out late at night in cities like Mumbai, working as nurses, as factory workers, in call centers. It has been said that the face of India's mission to Mars is female because most of the scientists working on it are women. I was educated almost entirely by women teachers through school and college. I lived in India for 40 years. I routinely go out late at night, and I know many people who do so. So to create this impression that if you go out at night after 9 p.m., you'll be raped and people will approve of your being raped is ridiculous. Jyoti Pandey's story itself, the story of the girl who was raped and murdered, is typical of upward social mobility in India today, where individual mobility is generally inextricable from family mobility. This is her father. He moved from his village to Delhi to educate his children. He worked as an airport loader. She was the only daughter. He was very proud of her. Both the parents were very proud of her, and she was an extremely vivacious girl who was adored by her two younger brothers. She used to give tuitions to neighborhood children to supplement her father's income. Now, it was a story of upward mobility fueled by the parents' dedication to their children's education. And every Indian is familiar with many such stories. We see them all around us. She was on the bus. Now, on the bus, she had gone to see an English medium movie. She had gone to see The Life of Pi. And she was with her boyfriend. She was wearing jeans. So she appeared as if she may have been of a higher class than the rapist. But actually, this wasn't true. She, as well as the rapist murderers, were all fairly recent migrants from villages in the same state that adjoins Delhi. The only difference, the primary difference I can see is that her family was intact and very much behind the children's education, her education. She was the oldest child. And their families, they came from really dysfunctional, broken families, and had, not that I'm not making any kind of excuse for them, but that's the only difference I could see in the backgrounds. Now, I mentioned that Parliament refused to make rape gender neutral. What this means is that a man who is raped by another man cannot sue for rape. He can only sue for sodomy under the anti-sodomy law which the British introduced in India in 1861, under which unnatural sex is punishable with up to 10 years imprisonment. So interestingly, for rape you get 7 years imprisonment, and for sodomy, for consensual sex between men, you get 10 years, you can get up to 10 years imprisonment. In 2010, Professor Ramchandra Siras, age 64, he was a professor at Aligarh Muslim University. He was suspended from the university on grounds of misconduct because a television crew barged into his house and filmed him having consensual sex with another man, a Muslim man, Irfan. LGBT groups and intellectuals protested, went to his aid and so on. He had worked there for 40 years. He was very close to retirement. Within months of retirement, he was shamed, he was isolated, he was thrown out of his house, and then in court he actually won his case. After he won his case, he spoke to the journalist saying that he now wants to work for the gay community in India. And the next day he was found dead of poisoning in very suspicious circumstances. I suspect that it was a murder. Many people do. But the police just hushed it up as suicide, and the police then repeatedly interrogated and beat up his sexual partner, who was a very poor man, who was a poor rickshaw puller. And that man, a few months later, tried to burn himself to death. His wife saved his life, but he was severely burnt. And then there's been very little public outcry about these victims. I'm sure you've never heard of them, right? So there's been the national media did report it, but not in the way it reported the rapes. The international media didn't report it. So 2 men basically were killed. Last year, the Supreme Court upheld the anti-sodomy law, which had been overturned by a lower court. And their reason was that LGBT people are a minuscule minority, so their existence is not a solid basis to rule that the law is unconstitutional. And the Parliament hasn't discussed the question. I mentioned that Parliament immediately discussed the rape question and passed the law. Now, why is it that the victims of this law are not commemorated with anything like the same fervor as rape victims? Perhaps because the public doesn't see them as innocent. And many women's organizations, LGBT organizations, civil rights groups all over the country are working to change attitudes to sexuality, which are changing rapidly, I would say. This is a picture of one such group, which holds a regular sexuality studies workshop every year, but this is a long and slow process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for that presentation. We now have time for questions from the audience. There is a microphone here if you would like to come up and ask either of the presenters a question about their topic and their presentation. Please. Perhaps this could stimulate you to thinking of some comparative issues that would link political and legal reform, thinking about an other, an internal other, and the question of justice. Thank you, Michelle.
So the audience is not silent. I will start. To be a token speaker. Anyway, a question for Ruth. Ruth, do you think that in many cases, this working class, lower class, speaking as post-Marxist, I'm not, elitist discourse, lower class, rape done by lower class men, is that you could analyze or find some class resentment which cannot express itself anymore because of the containment or disappearance, perhaps, of the Communist Party, although it's still very alive in India. Where does class resentment is channeled except through the linear molar lines, would Deleuze said, through sex? And there's attack on women who look like successful, who have escaped their condition. Or, is there such an element, or it's...
Okay. That has, of course, been suggested, but I totally don't agree with it. There are many ways of channeling class resentment. We don't find similar episodes of lower-class men, so-called lower-class men, for instance, beating up repeatedly upper-class men. Why don't they pick on men? Why do they pick on women? So I think there's something much more going on than just class resentment. There's gender resentment. They think that a woman's place is at home. They come with these values, and they think that a woman's place is at home. And not all families agree. Obviously, Jyoti's father didn't agree with that. The other point I wanted to mention, though, is that that the Delhi police reported that 9 out of 10 rapes are by a person known to the woman and her family and friends, which is, of course, the case everywhere in the world. But all the major protests have, of course, and all the big rapes that media have picked up have all been stranger rapes and not rapes by anyone known to the woman.
There must be someone else with a question for either talk. Thank you, Maria.
Well, thank you first for the two presentations. They were fascinating, both of them. This is a question for Fazia. Fazia, I would like you to clarify, like, I think that at the beginning of your presentation, when you were talking about lacism, did you mention or did you say that that was kind of like an inconvenient word or a bad word, or can you clarify that? What the substratum or what it means for French society, lacism.
Racism?
Yeah, lacism.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you said that you said like a bad word or an inconvenient word.
Oh.
I just wanted you to expand on that.
I don't think I said that it was an inconvenient word or a bad word. I think that it is used, this concept of laïcité, which is very important in French society, basically puts, the community which is usually which illustrates this this idea of laïcité is supposedly the Jewish community, where they are Jewish at home, but outside they are French. And therefore they don't show any sign of religion outside of their home, and they just practice their religion at home. And which, I would have issues with even that, that idea, because you can see in France, people wearing all kinds of religious signs and symbols, whether the kippah or, the cross. But there's this kind of this idea that the veil cannot basically be accepted in French society. And I think that the argument that is put forward is this idea of laïcité, which is against any sign of religion, and which goes back to the law, in 1905, which divides the state and the church. And I think that this is always an idea which is interesting, because growing up in France, where it's supposed to be a secular state, and the school, which is the French Republic, which is associated with the French Republic and the values of the French Republic. I remember growing up in school and having a Christmas tree in our in our elementary school every year, and we of course celebrate. We used to celebrate Christmas and all the other religious celebrations, and it was not perceived. I think that at some point it became cultural. It was not perceived as something religious, but it's still part of it. But somehow I think that the French are blinded about that. They don't see that it is actually signs of of religion. So I think that the veil is actually a kind of a sign of something that is that people feel very fearful about today. And I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead.
My question is just more general. Curious to hear about how the Algerian War is thought about today in French society. And, the film The Battle of Algiers, of course, very gruesome and depicting the violence and terrorism between both sides. And, you have Jean-Paul Sartre and anti-colonialist. But I'm more curious about the general, depiction of the war in Algeria and how that might, relate, of course, to the French Muslims, as you talked about in the conclusion to your paper.
Thank you for this question. I think that it's very much, I don't know if you've seen this movie called Caché by this Haneke, Michael Haneke, which is a movie about a bourgeois family, a bourgeois Parisian family, which basically discovers that the male character who is very famous and has a good job. There's a whole history behind his success, and also the fact that he has forgotten about one very important event in his life, which was that there was a little boy in his family who was supposed to be adopted by his parents, and this boy lost his parents, both his parents, in a march in October 1961 in Paris, which was where the marchers were Algerians, and they were basically marching against the curfew that was made only for Algerians in 1961. They were not supposed to leave their houses or their homes after 9 p.m. And so the marchers were protesting against this, and the parents of the child had actually died in the repression that followed this march. And so the male character in this movie receives these anonymous cassettes, and he realizes, there's a whole past that comes back to haunt him. And we realize in this movie that there is this past which France is not confronting really to this day, and it's all we are talking about, the veil and Islam and how it's incompatible with laïcité. But basically, there is, the post-colonial France is present. We can see it, in the banlieues, in those suburbs, of French major cities. And there is, it's coming up, and it's coming up in different ways. And I think that the assessment that politicians and a lot of right-wing intellectuals are doing is basically, not confronting this reality, which has to do with the colonial past, France's colonial past. And one example, one illustration of this is that in France, at the university level, we still do not have, in France, the universities, you still cannot take courses on colonialism, on France's presence in France, in Algeria, I mean, and all these post-colonial issues are just coming up right now because, especially of translations of some major books, from post-colonial studies, the movement of post-colonial studies in the U.S. I think I'll stop here.
I have a quick question for Ruth, because I know you have to go. So in your opinion, you made it pretty clear that you think that the rape laws are too extreme in India now. In comparison to like Montana and the US's laws in general, what would you think the best, like, should they scale their laws back to the US's form of rape laws, or maybe something in between? What do you think should be done in India?
No, I don't want to use the US as a model, and I don't even know very much about the US's rape laws. But I think the Indian rape law, there are several things that should be done. It should be made gender and male rape should be recognized. It should be marital rape should be recognized, and the punishment for rape should not be more severe. I don't think the death penalty should be a punishment for repeat rape, and in fact, I don't think the death penalty should exist at all. But particularly in the context of rape, I don't think it should be, certainly not be a punishment for rape, and I don't think the burden of proof should be shifted. The media, Indian media, for example, the minute a rape is reported, for instance, there was a famous case of a very major left-wing journalist whom the right-wing regime really hated and had hated for a long time. And there was this famous case of him being with his employee in an elevator for a minute. And she alleged that he manually penetrated her in that time. And then the media picked it up and referred to him as a rapist continuously for weeks and weeks and weeks. So there was basically a media trial. His career, he spent 7 months in jail. The trial hasn't even begun yet. Now he's out on bail. But basically his career is ruined. So I think the media needs to be reined in. You can't prejudge in that way. And I think the laws should take care of that as well. So I think a fair trial and shifting the burden of proof, the innocent person, that innocence is presumed. I think it's a very dangerous thing to presume guilt and to have to refute guilt. A person has to be assumed to be innocent till they are proved guilty in any crime, including murder, for instance.
Thank you. I'm going to pause here because as Professor Vanita does have a class that begins in 5 minutes. And thank you all for coming to our panel. You are more than welcome to come up and talk with the presenters afterwards. Professor Vanita will be leaving momentarily, but Professor Atyal is here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.